We are so excited to launch another day of exciting discussions today, ranging from the digital health space all the way to the agriculture, innovation, and new technologies there. Just a couple of housekeeping notes from me. So we've had so many excellent questions coming through for our previous panel discussions. So please do keep these coming in the Slido function on your web portal. In addition, we have a number of networking sessions today, and you'll see the link for spatial and the times in your agenda to join for those. And in terms of connecting our Leader of Tomorrow cohort, I wanted to flag that tomorrow, we're very excited that for the first time ever, we'll be running a social at the end of the event on the spatial platform as well. So please do join and make the most of that opportunity as well. And with that, I will pass over to Michael Kiebish from Berg Health, who's the Precision Medicine Chief Officer, who will then chair this exciting discussion titled The Digital Health Revolution. So thank you so much, Michael, for sharing this discussion, and over to you to introduce this panel.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you to the panel. I really appreciate everyone's cooperation and participation here. It's really an honor and a pleasure to speak on this topic. Digital health is really evolving and moving into new spaces. I think every single person on the panel and the industry has a different definition for digital health and how it impacts healthcare as a whole, whether the components of an entrepreneurship, or the aspect of the patient, whether at the algorithm level or the operational level, how the patient interacts with the healthcare system. It's a unique space and will really be the future economies of the world. When you look at healthcare as a global space, it's a £8 trillion industry and much more than that. If you look at the players in the healthcare and digital health space, both from pharma and tech, we're dealing with companies that range from $1 trillion to $2 trillion of market cap. In pharma, we're dealing with 100 billion to even upwards of $350 billion of market cap. The future and merger of pharma, technology, and healthcare really will be the future economy. The key components are to engage, to ensure access, to ensure integration, and to ensure that whether it's someone in London, whether it's someone in Kenya, whether it's someone in Atlanta or Osaka, Japan, or a single mother or a grandmother or parent, everyone has access. So the technology really needs to evolve in this space. And another key component is, I think all of us recognize now during the COVID era that our health is going to be prescribed through a digital portal. It really opened everyone's eyes. But our remit is really to look at what the 5-10 years really looks like in the digital health space. I don't think many of us, if any of us, pre-COVID, imagined every single visit to the doctor might be virtual. But now that's a reality. And the efficacy and the efficiency of delivery is essential. One key component I want to mention is, again, the social component. Society and access is critical. I'll quote one reference, Abraham Lincoln. The only way to predict the future is to create it. And the individuals on the panel here are actually creating the future of digital health through operations, through really unique entrepreneurial mechanisms to target neural biomarkers, patient care, societal change, algorithms, and the interface. So I'm really looking forward to the conversations, the questions, and the engagement. And I think it's going to be a very fruitful discussion. With that being said, I'll kind of go around. I know we don't have a actual round table or panelists sitting next side by side, so I will pick panelists one by one to introduce themselves, to give a background maybe on their exposure to digital health and their interest, and also their passion, and maybe a brief statement of where they see the future really going. So I'll first start off with Natalie. If you can provide an introduction and background, I'd really appreciate it.
Sure, thanks, Michael, and hi everyone. It's great to be here. Thank you for having me. So by background, I'm trained as a medical researcher, and though I'm not a practicing clinician, not a practicing doctor, I am a translational scientist, and I've worked with doctors to support preclinical and clinical research. I've also worked in the public sector, nonprofit sector, academia, as well as pharma, biotech, health tech startups. So I've got a pretty broad 360 view of medicine and healthcare. And what really motivates me is in healthcare, thinking back to every doctor and every patient that I've worked with, and really seeing their challenges and struggles, and wanting to use my knowledge, experience, everything that I've learned about technology to really alleviate those pain points. I think doctors are such amazing people, and they care so much about their patients. It's really amazing to see in action. And what's really scary and sad is how much they're struggling, how much they're burdened, how much there is pressure on them that's caused by poor systems, poor processes, sometimes really bad technology. And I've just got a lot of passion and excitement about some of the new technologies that are now coming out to unlock some of those pressures and reduce some of those pressures. So I've operated startups in AI for imaging, AI automation for data movement, data sharing, blockchain technology as well. And so it's really exciting for me to see some of these technologies kind of taking hold now. And so currently I'm operating Metadvice. It's a clinical decision support software company that's using AI for decision support in precision medicine, really for complex disease. So things like cardiovascular disease, complex cancers, and so on.
Oh, excellent. Thank you, Natalie. With a clinician in mind, I'd like to introduce Saira.
Hi, thank you. And thank you very much for having me. So I'm Saira Ghafur. I am the lead for digital health at the Institute of Global Health Innovation at Imperial College. And I'm also a practicing respiratory physician at St Mary's Hospital. So some of the work that I do at Imperial looks at cybersecurity for healthcare, evidence generation and digital health technologies, looking at health data and how we can use it in commercial purposes, and also AI, machine learning in low and middle income countries. I'm also the co-founder of two healthcare startups. One is called SIMA, which deals with mental health, and the other one is Prova Health, which is evidence generation for digital health. My passion and my drive behind digital health is really the kind of patient experience of it, both having experienced a healthcare system myself as a clinician, but also a patient, but also being the carer for someone, see how the patient experience is not great, and whether that's in the US or the UK or wherever you are. We often talk about patient-centered care, and I think this is one of the biggest misnomers in healthcare. More often than not, it is system-centered care or clinician-centered care. And if we really want meaningful engagement for patients, they need to be the center of everything. And I think digital technologies are definitely the way forward to make them a more equal part of their healthcare journey.
No, thank you very much. Now we'll transition to the tech side of things. Aditya, can you introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. My name is Aditya Nori, and I lead the Health Intelligence Group at Microsoft Research, Cambridge in the UK. And my areas of research are machine learning for health and life sciences and programming languages. Our mission is to really transform the practice of medicine via what we call trusted and human-centered AI. And to that end, we work in the areas of mental health, hospital care, immunomics, medical imaging, and synthetic biology. I think what's very key is also, as both Saira and Natalie mentioned, it's to be patient-centered. And to that end, I think as far as machine learning or AI is concerned, we also need to build solutions that are trusted. And for that, we need these solutions to be reliable, transparent, fair, and secure. And I think we're making good steps towards data-driven medicine as well. And I find that to be really exciting. And I think that's what the future is going to look like. Delighted to be here and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you. And last but not least, Oliver.
Hi, Michael. Thank you for inviting me to the panel. So I'm Oliver Armitage. I'm the co-founder and chief scientific officer of BIOS Health, based in Cambridge in the UK and also in Montreal in Canada. At BIOS, we're a sort of neural interfaces company, so we use the nervous system to treat chronic diseases. The nervous system carries huge amounts of data, controlling every one of your organs, telling them what to do in real time. And by using AI and machine learning, we can translate those neural signals into neural biomarkers that tell us about organ function and disease progression. And we can understand and correct these signals that allows us to deliver digital therapeutics via the body's natural data transmission system, which is the nervous system. So for BIOS, digital health goes a long way beyond apps and digital health into sort of direct digital treatments, electrical and physical therapeutics delivered via the nervous system for alleviating everything from hypertension to diabetes and bladder control.
No, thank you. As the audience can see, we have 4 major pillars of the digital health industry being represented within the panel. And I think we're going to get a very diverse, very insightful opinions around this. So I'll transition to asking the panel, and I'll go through various panel members key questions, which we're hoping to have an open-ended discussion, maybe go more roundtable format. So I'll first start off with a question around a concept and a theme, adoption of digital health. So how will we as a society and industry adopt and expand digital health into our everyday life? And how is this going to look like in the next 5 or 10 years? And the key is to really dive into what's worked, what hasn't worked, what the vision really is. So I'll start off with Natalie, since you've had so much experience with operationalizing digital health, and maybe you can comment on this question.
Sure, thanks, Michael. So I always think it's helpful to kind of start with a very brief history of what happened with EMRs when we talk about things like decision support. When EMRs first came to market, they were not designed for patient care. So they were designed for things like billing, revenue cycle management, and there were some incentives that have developed over decades to adopt those systems, particularly in the US. That adoption has been slower in the UK, and I think it's still not fully digitized in the UK. I think there was a survey that was done last year that said only 10% of trusts are fully digitized. So it's definitely been slower. But there's these systems that have been put in place that are quite heavy, that people are reluctant to change. And so with the advent of new technologies and new systems like, let's say, our AI decision support systems, there's a reluctance to kind of overhaul anything that's in existence, and whatever you make has to integrate within existing workflows. And this can be quite challenging because some of the existing systems aren't always welcoming to new technology integration. So nobody wants to undertake this massive transformational effort. There's a significant amount of training that goes into using some of the existing EMR technology, for example. And so you really have to have this very high activation energy barrier that you need to breach to kind of get over that hump. And so what we have found and what we've learned, what I've learned over the years, is that technology has to be as intuitive as possible, has to be as easy as possible for doctors to use, has to, again, sit within their existing workflows somehow, and it has to really answer for the doctor the question, why bother with it? How is it going to make my life easier that previous technology, hasn't already done? And so we've done a lot of co-design, both on the back end and on the front end with doctors directly. So contributing to validation of AI algorithms, making sure that they're really answering the right questions for the doctors in terms of decision support. Making sure that there is explainability of AI, so none of these black box algorithms. You want doctors to understand as much as possible where a recommendation is coming from. So we've integrated that. and really designing on the front end also the interfaces, so as much co-design as possible. And I think it sounds like something that's pretty intuitive that you should do, but unfortunately not everybody does this. And so you end up with a lot of technology that hasn't, you haven't brought in the clinician early enough, or you haven't done enough iterations with them. And so it's not then widely adopted. But there is also, that once you have the technology built and you want it to spread, there's a requirement for massive education around the benefits of the technology. And again, how can it make my life easier? Because what sometimes we find is that the clinicians that help develop the technology are not the same types of clinicians that you then want to use the technology. And so you have to kind of integrate all the learnings from the doctors that you've worked with and distribute those learnings to the general doctors that will be using the technology, and work with them really, really closely. And it's hard. It's definitely not easy. We're still at very early phases of that at Metadvice, for example, and it does take time, and sometimes it doesn't work.
No, awesome. I can't say it enough how much I've heard the educational component is absolutely essential, and that's one of the major roadblocks, and it will take time. But I think you raised some excellent points, and allow a lot of other panelists also to comment as we kind of progress through. With technology in mind, Aditya, I mean, you sit at the forefront of application and integration of AI, whether it's Bayesian or other type of tools. Where do you see the adoption from a Microsoft perspective, but also your own perspective in this particular field?
Well, thanks, Michael. So I think the healthcare industry has made really great strides in the last decade with respect to digitizing healthcare. And I think, as Natalie mentioned, the electronic health record is a good example where the primary motivation was for more accurate billing as opposed to providing better care and improving patient outcomes. So I really think that the next decade will be about turning various digital assets into better healthcare insights, better experiences, and I think most importantly, better patient outcomes. And to make a step towards adoption from a tech standpoint, I think we also probably need to develop systems in a different manner. So it's not just about getting access to data and developing these so-called AI systems, but it's also having perhaps a deeper ethnographic understanding of the practice of medicine, and then combining that perhaps with deep learning. To give you a sense for why this is important, it's probably worthwhile for me to share my experience working with the ICU unit of a hospital from a few years ago. So we worked with intensivists in a unit, and they were very keen on the question of whether AI could help with reducing patient burden. And what they meant by this was whether we could use data analytics to improve the patient journey in the hospital or in the ICU. So this included figuring out if a patient could be discharged, for instance, so that they could die with dignity with their family. So we kind of interpreted this as using the ICU data for a patient. Can we predict the length of stay for the patient in the ICU? And that's what we worked on from a machine learning or AI point of view. We learned a lot while working on the project, and a positive takeaway was that we understood the complexities and potential of data. There were insights that we learned from the data that were consistent with clinician expectations. Unfortunately, we did not have sufficient context to understand the question and create actionable and trusted responses. And furthermore, very importantly, we did not consider synergy with humans. In other words, there's a really huge gap between what we were trying to achieve with data and how decision-making was actually progressing in the ICU. And to put it very simply, decision-making in the ICU is a very social and human process, and that's something that our solutions did not take into account, and our research didn't take this into account. And I think this is really key. The human aspect is really key when we develop tech solutions.
No, I think you nailed it. I think digital health has to have a human anchor point in it. And that being said, someone who understands the clinician's experience the best, Saira, if you can comment on your view adoption, since you were at the front line and made such excellent points in your introduction of how important it is to interact with humans, how the interface has to almost adapt, and the doctor does still have to be point and center with this decision support.
Yeah, and I think just picking up from Natalie's point, just about the kind of making sure that clinicians can use it. I think one of the biggest roadblocks to kind of adopting any kind of technology in healthcare institutions is healthcare professionals. Essentially, if you don't like the look of it, or if you have that preconceived misconception that this is, going to be really awful to use and really complicated, you just don't. And when you look at different, EHR systems, it's literally you've got 7 different programs up from different places, and they don't interact with one another. And it's insane, isn't it, when you think how much progress we've made in some aspects of our life, and then you think of healthcare, which is the poor cousin that's been left behind, and you're trying to mess around with different systems. But it's that user experience is front and center, and I think very much in healthcare we've seen that systems are cumbersome, they're difficult to use, they're not intuitive, and you just don't interact as much with them, and you don't extrapolate the full utility of that tool that you've got in front of you. So I think that is so key. And when you're moving on to the patient side of things, clearly digital is the way forward. We've demonstrated it over the past couple of months since COVID, whether that's clinician facing, 90% of our appointments are done through remote consultations in the outpatient. We would never have envisaged that. Pre-COVID, maybe 5% of them were done as remote consultations in secondary care. Now it's our go-to. We always thought, patients would find it difficult. Again, 90% of our consultations, that's all our patients are using these remote technologies. But we've kind of made it simple, we've made it easy, and it's kind of making sure that all of these new systems that we put are right and fit for purpose as we move forward. And actually is that user experience, user design, is key to both sides, whether it's patient-facing, clinician-facing. It's got to work, it's got to be easy, and then you see the kind of rewards of it, and people come back, they want to use it, they see that it's making their life easier on both sides. So I think certainly key to what we're doing as we move forward.
So Saira, what actually does not absolutely work for the patient interface that you've experienced? I know you kind of describe the challenges, but what absolutely does not work that someone needs to come up with a bit more improved solution around that digital health solution as a clinician?
I think one of the most difficult things is, you've got patients who are at one end of the spectrum, that it's a kind of transactional appointment that you have with your clinician that, I've got a chest infection, I need antibiotics. It's a one-off interaction. But actually, the majority of patients that we see time and time again is the chronic health conditions. So they're not just going to one clinician, they're going to their primary care practitioner, to secondary care physicians, and it's not just one, it's multiple, whether it's a specialist nurse or whether it's a consultant in X specialty. And despite the fact that we have EHRs, or, we think we have some kind of continuum of care, we really don't. And that makes it so difficult for the patients. Because they have this, if you think as a clinician that other clinicians would know what's going on with that patient, then as the patient, your belief is that people talk to each other, people communicate, and that is really not the case. And if we don't make that simple for patients, for that, the background of it all is to make sure that it's connected. We're creating all of these silos of information, silos of data, and we're just absolutely exacerbating the burden of information, whether it's on the patient side, the physician side. So all of these, here, use this app, this will make your life great, but it's not interoperable with the EHR. So actually, you're not capturing any data that's going to be meaningful, or use this will be great. So until we really fix that back end, we cannot put that burden onto patients to again do the same thing of like going from back to front, trying to explain everything over and over again, because it just adds to that absolute burden on them.
Oh, amazing. And in products in mind, Oliver, I mean, you have a very unique and interesting and powerful company in BIOS and tackling a really big problem of neurobiomarkers and integration. How do you see the adoption from a patient, a user perspective, both globally, but even with the product you're exploring?
Thank you, and thank you for the previous panelists as well. I think everyone's sort of really, some people call them incentives and some people call them roadblocks. The concept of user interfaces and ease of use and data interoperability. And I think it's important to remember that the incentives people use are change in health, change in quality of life, change in mobility and modality, and then change in cost, right? It's change in health and change in cost. Those are the incentives for using something. Then there are a whole load of barriers as why people then, even if they beat those incentives, they won't then take on systems, because they have poor interfaces, poor integration with other systems, or other things that can make them difficult to use. And so from our perspective, we really focus on, how can we truly improve health with digital health. COVID has massively accelerated the adoption of maybe what could be considered the first wave of digital health, the video appointments, the remote monitoring, the sort of the remote tests, all those kinds of things. But the full integration of digital health, the sort of the full IoT integration that your phone has managed to have with the sort of Google server, where it's not just your phone is not just sort of reporting its outcomes, it's actually changing. The voice app on your phone is getting better as you use it, because it's constantly learning back with Google's backend or Apple's backend. And so being able to actually improve treatments, so deliver a therapy, but be able to update that therapy via software, the equivalent of in pharmaceuticals of changing a dosage continually based on outcomes through a patient's life. I think those things are going to be the wave of digital health beyond the one that COVID has already brought upon us fantastically. COVID, I think, will do fantastic things for healthcare in terms of infrastructure and support and what it means for the ecosystem. So but once you've got all that in there, and you've got this nice infrastructure, and it is all integrated, you then have to use that data for discovery of new treatments and then delivery of those treatments and therapeutics. And so you just have to look at the mechanisms that allow you to do that. So you can think about changing a prescription, changing when someone has an appointment, changing a therapy directly if it can be changed digitally, such as a neural therapy. And so I think it's a really good way of thinking about what's happened to digital health so far, and then where it goes next.
Oh, thank you so much. And since we, as I was thinking about it, the patient centricity is so essential, and we've talked so much about the incentive to the patient. I'll actually kind of move toward the catalyst. I think COVID was a catalyst for telemedicine. COVID was a catalyst to re-engineer healthcare on the fly. I think as a society, whether it's in the UK or globally or US, we've adapted. We also recognize the challenge. I'll kind of start back with you, Oliver. What have you seen? What will be the catalyst next year, this year, and maybe in 5 years that you see will just open up the field and just create the kind of products and solutions that are absolutely necessary, whether it be just uniqueness or the algorithm component of it?
Yeah, you're right. COVID has been a really powerful catalyst for transition in the way healthcare can be delivered. I think the next major catalyst is going to be the one that we all thought was going to be the catalyst of the first wave before COVID turned up and trumped it, which was sort of aging population, burden of long-term disease. As we get better and better at treating acute interventions, fewer and fewer people die from acute problems. It's more and more 76% of healthcare spending is on chronic diseases. As Saira noted, most of the patients that you see are not your sort of single transactional, here's your antibiotic for your chest infection, but they're the patients who have repeat management for their diabetes, repeat management for their heart failure, repeat management for their liver disease. And so with those patients, it's the thing that we thought was going to be this first catalyst, but had got trumped by COVID. And for those people, the step change they need is sort of like holistic management. So they need integration of all these different services. They don't need 4 different apps going into 4 different cloud backends, which get looked at through 4 different web pages, because doctors don't want to have 12 hyperlinks for each patient that they have to follow to get to look at all these data and try and mentally build the picture of their health. They want to see all their data coming into a single location. So all of those things are going to be massive barriers, the integration between digital services. and then linking that to therapy change to manage long-term conditions.
Oh, excellent. And I can't say enough how much I've heard that the communication between different technologies has been the biggest challenge. I know I've worked with companies like DocBox, which takes different instruments, whether it be Philips on a bed, a patient bed, and connecting with different, and there's a gap. There's a huge gap from technology, and that seems to be an area that really needs to be focused on even more. So I'll kind of move toward Aditya from a catalyst perspective, since you're at the forefront of the algorithm catalyst and also the vision of, as you described, the front line of using technology to implement big change. What do you see, Aditya, as a catalyst from your perspective where you sit?
Yeah, I think, as Oliver said, the pandemic has been a huge catalyst for innovation, and we've seen all kinds of advances ranging from digital bots to accelerated trials. Things that would have taken 5 years earlier were done in a matter of months. I think as far as I think the effects of this are going to kind of carry forward for a few years because we've seen what's possible as far as digital innovation goes. I also think the other catalyst is also driven by need. So given that half of the world's population does not have access to essential services, and the other half that do, this access is often compromised by services which are buckling under pressure of increased demand, costs, workloads, etc. I think my fond hope is that digital innovation will help ensure equity in access. And at the same time, I think the tricky bit is to also make sure that by way of technologies, we do not increase health inequalities for those who cannot access the technologies. So I think the digital wave, I suppose, thanks to the pandemic, has begun. And one hopes that we will not use pandemics as a way to actually further innovation.
And I actually completely agree. And kind of playing on catalyst versus detriment, this technology here has been a life savior for every one of the panelists and every one of the audience out there. However, it has become also a burden, an electronic leash, a point of anxiety, a point of email checking at 2 o'clock in the morning. Saira, seeing a clinician, but also a patient perspective, whether you look at it as whatever tech catalyst comes in, there'll also be a burden on mental health, on anxiety, on access, and sometimes even challenges, because our world has now changed. So Saira, can you comment on where you see both the catalyst, but also the potential negative consequences of technology and digital health that have to be kept in mind to avoid from a patient perspective?
Certainly, I think, even from our mental health startup, what we've seen in the past couple of months is that anxiety associated with working from home. Everyone's had to change their way of life very quickly. The burden of technology, your emails are definitely going off, and if you're not answering your emails, somebody WhatsApps you, or there's multiple channels of communication now, and it's respecting boundaries, but also kind of making sure that an individual is setting their own boundaries as well. There's also the confusion with tech for patients as well. So they're getting bombarded with like multiple text messages about their appointments and how it's changed. And I think that's quite, overwhelming when, you've got your usual expectation of, you're going to get a letter for your appointment to go to X place. And now I think with the kind of changes in communication, people are getting lots of different text messages, emails, etc. And sometimes it's not a very joined up system. So I think that burden of information again, but also, how people are using the technology as well. So it's kind of, you've got all of these symptom checkers at home as well. You've got your Apple phone to monitor your heart rate, whichever technology that you have. So, in some ways it's great, it's brilliant. You're going to kind of, really help people monitor various symptoms, use symptom checkers, various algorithms, etc. But it's kind of you're adding in the anxiety, going from, Googling your symptoms to, oh, actually, I can check this symptom at home myself. Oh my God, I think I'm having a heart attack, or I've got this going on. So it's that whole, we're bringing in these technologies. It's brilliant. You're kind of disaggregating information, you're kind of making it more equitable in terms of information. But at the same time, we need to caveat any new technology with the fact that it will increase anxiety, it will increase stress on that user's experience side of things. And you've got to think, people with health anxiety, they're the first people who will go and get X technology to see if their symptoms really are meaningful. So it's kind of trying to kind of package that with some reassurance somewhat.
No, excellent points. And it seems that dashboards to centralize the information and to focus on the most important are absolutely critical. And whether it's a Microsoft generated dashboard, Metadvice generated interface. I mean, Natalie, can you comment on how you see the catalyst and actually the solution for the deluge of information coming to patients, and how to solve that and bridge between the doctor, their insurance company, or NHS, or even just maybe the child or caregiver of a patient? How do you see this industry really evolving, since you've been part and parcel to every aspect of it?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and it's tough because there is so much information, and it's coming from a variety of different sources to a variety of different audiences, and then sometimes you have to kind of reconcile that, right? And so what we're thinking about now, what we kind of see the demand and interest for, is this kind of shared decision-making processes between the doctor and the patient. So being able to have the patient, have choice and have some of those, recommendations and rationale, decisions, being able to view those, but at the same time be able to discuss those with a doctor. So things like shared interfaces is something that we're thinking about very, very closely, and is on our roadmap. And it's something that doctors are also very interested in having, because we constantly get these questions from doctors about, how can I share this information best with my patient? The current systems aren't exactly conducive to that. It's hard, to show a patient anything on a typical EMR screen. And so the way that we're creating dashboards are, user-friendly, again, ways where a doctor can actually share a dashboard with their patient and see, look, this is what's going on. This is what's happening. This is what happened, a few years back. This is where you are now, and this is where you're headed. And these are our options for management, right? And so it's that kind of shared decision-making process where you don't get this kind of Dr. Google syndrome, where a patient comes into the doctor and says, look, I found this online. This is really exciting. Can you treat me with this? Because doctors aren't responsive to that. And it's not the doctor driving into the patient, look, you got to eat this diet, or you got to exercise this many times a day, because that also doesn't work. So it's kind of the creating those channels of information. And again, coming back to what Oliver has said earlier, being able to integrate the various technologies, because I think that is really, really important. And we've got so much exciting technology coming down the pipeline now. We've got, VR, and you've got voice, and you've got all sorts of things, and robotics interfacing with biological systems. I think, 5-10 years from now, when all of those systems, hopefully sooner rather than later, when they can interface and when they can interact, and I think that's when you're going to see real change in healthcare and in business models, really, and outcomes.
And we're getting some really great questions on the chat that I'll kind of migrate more toward with integration of patient data, with the diversity and acceleration of data. It becomes a concern about security, and how are we going to handle the security in both globally and even so with the UK. From my perspective, it's a major challenge, but maybe I'll reach out to Saira. How do you foresee, as a clinician, as a practicing clinician, the security being adapted or being handled around, the explosion of digital health?
I think it's got to be such an integral part of any kind of technologies that we develop, and we've got to make sure that everything is fit for purpose for use. And certainly a lot of the kind of studies that we've done our department, when you're kind of looking at that patient-facing side of things, first and foremost, it's always security and privacy concerns that patients say. But all the cybersecurity work that we do, you've got to see that cybersecurity is not a tech issue, this is a patient safety issue. Anything that goes wrong with any technology that you're using essentially to treat patients with, if there's any delay in care, if you can't see test results, if patients can be treated at that point in time, that is a patient safety issue. So I think this is how we've got to perceive this as a threat in healthcare. We've got to make sure that security is part and parcel of any technology that is put out there. And it's not a retrofit, which has been the case. Certainly the WannaCry attack, which was a cybersecurity attack, which inadvertently hit the NHS in 2017, was a big wake-up call for health systems globally. And since then, we've seen some kind of big attacks in various different countries, in the US and Singapore. And more recently with COVID-related, we saw the CDC and the WHO have cyber threats as well. So I think this has got to be fundamental. One of the key things is education. So I think for all healthcare professionals using any EHRs, any technologies, that they are custodians of data, and they need to take this as seriously as the next person. And it's not an IT issue. This is fundamentally patient safety.
No, absolutely. And with Microsoft being at the forefront of security and technology and also all aspects of software, Aditya, can you comment your view on how you or your organization or even the industry is handling security of this data and integrity of this data?
Absolutely. So I think from a tech or even a machine learning or AI standpoint, given that the solutions in question crucially depend on data, it also means that these solutions need to be developed in a secure and privacy preserving manner. So just to give you some examples, if you're training a machine learning algorithm which consumes data, then the training process needs to be privacy preserving. Another thing which is not very obvious is the fact that if you have a machine learning system providing recommendations or what have you, then the model itself, the program that runs or the software that runs should not leak information. So for example, what you don't want is a program trying to do a diagnosis for a patient, and inadvertently an adversary can actually query the model and figure out other information about the patient. So it's over and above things that we take for granted, that the data is protected when we actually build these kinds of systems. And Microsoft and other companies as well are working on solutions which protect patient data, machine learning models, and it's a very active area of research as well. So,
nice. In around security and around patient data, the concept of privacy laws have really opened everyone's mindset from how government is regulating patient data and also allowing for the communication of patient data. I know Oliver and Natalie, you have exposure both to the UK and the Canadian system of how they are approaching it. And maybe Natalie, can you comment on how you are looking at to adapt and handle these privacy laws? Because I know in the UK, a lot of data has to be streamlined through certain mechanisms through embassies, has to be locked in different ways. How are you and your company, and what solutions do you see adapting to these privacy law changes?
Yeah, sure. So we, as a company, we work within existing privacy laws, within existing, GDPR compliance or HIPAA compliance infrastructures. We are lucky in some sense that we don't necessarily need personally identifiable information, and we can transform data to kind of not require certain private information about patients, and work with that kind of transformed data to be able to draw out insights and be able to train our algorithms. But it actually, those infrastructures, those data infrastructures are helpful more so than harmful in some ways, because they've got requirements for the use of data. If it's for patient benefit, then you can use that data, you can process that data, provided you've defined who is the controller of the data, who is the processor, what is specifically being done within the data, for what purpose, and so on. And so we've been able to work quite well within existing data infrastructures, both in the UK, we also work in Switzerland, and in the US, actually.
Do you mind if I jump in quickly, Michael? I actually think GDPR is a really powerful opportunity for healthcare to solve part of this issue of data interoperability. What GDPR does is it makes the patient the owner of their data, and it means that the individual can always access everything that there is about them. Data can no longer end up siloed in any one private company. And what that means is that you can now do things like someone can want to have a digital health profile of themselves, and any service that they've used, whether it's public or private, whether they've had a genome profile, an RNA profile, a neural test, a remote monitoring app, that all of those companies are required to report that data back to the individual. And what that allows, and as this industry matures and sort of the format in which that gets done becomes more standardized, I actually think GDPR is a really good opportunity to centralize the data around the patient, who is the person that matters in this scenario.
Actually, if I just add to that, Oliver, I think it's also about educating the patients that they can do this and that they should do this, because there are data roadblocks that are created by certain companies, certain incumbents in the space. Those silos are being challenged now by certain laws, including GDPR, including, there's HHS legislation that's come out recently that's going to make it easier. But patients kind of need to be made aware that it's something that they're able to do, to collect their EHR information.
Yeah.
Those are excellent points. And I think so many different organizations have really engaged, again, going back to the patient centricity, whether it's organizations like Patient Like Me or even 23andMe. There's so many debates on when patients give their data, but versus using publicly available data, government level data. How do you overcome a lot of these laws? How do you build IP? How do you build a business around that? And it's a very critical avenue for exploration, which might evolve very rapidly too, especially as we move into the digital health space as much more the norm. There's a couple great questions coming in too. How can digital health tools monitor and integrate physical and mental health parameters to promote preventive healthcare? Maybe I'll send it to Saira, because I know you've really thought about this, and this is really your expertise.
I think, yeah, very much so. It's the integration of that data into any electronic health record. So if you're having digital health tools to monitor, for EHRs, you've got so remote monitoring systems. So even stuff that you use in a hospital, that feeds into the electronic health record. So you can do that. So now it's, if you're monitoring somebody at home, it does that feed directly into their EHR data. And until it does, again, it's that siloed information. But if it does, we can really, treat people in their homes. We can really help that continuum of care. And it's not just, an interaction with a clinician. You can actually meaningfully then treat them. And there've been some great pilots to show that, for physical health monitoring, that this does work. And it's making sure that that's kind of used by any of their clinicians watching that. From a mental health perspective, again, across the board, it is that interoperability of that data and who's seeing it and how you can kind of react to it. So in terms of mental health parameters, making sure that for whichever condition you're using for it, that there's what's the response team at the outset of it, who else is involved, and how can you actually really integrate all of that data to have a more comprehensive approach to that patient. But certainly I think there's so many different tools out in the market. Certainly in terms of using COVID as an example, we're changing pathways for care for respiratory, for example. We are treating more people at home with a pulse oximeter, or using it to monitor their condition with a pulse oximeter, because it's not safe for them to come to the hospital. It's difficult for patients to come to the hospital, and actually we don't want to overburden the health system either. But it's making sure that we can do that in a safe and effective way. We know pilots have worked, but it's kind of integrating that data into all other bits of information that, that clinician at the end of that can then make a, well-judged decision with all the evidence that they need. So I think there's some brilliant pilots in place, and it's kind of utilising it. And certainly COVID has helped us do some of that.
Oh, and that raises a very important point, whether using an oximeter or using different types of oximeters. How is everything being regulated, and how are we integrating diverse data sets? From a dashboard perspective, Natalie, I'd really love to hear your perspective if you're getting genomic data from different sources with different regulated angles, if you're actually being much more global, getting data from Epic or NHS. How are you operationalizing and streamlining this constant change of data sources into a uniform dashboard to keep up with it? Because the regulatory components are critical, and it can become a very big headache very quickly. So Natalie, how do you envision your perspective on how we're handling this in the digital health world?
Yeah, I think it's actually a really tough question, because there are so many data sources, and there is a challenge around what do you trust? And I know this is an issue for doctors, because not all data is necessarily trustworthy, and in the sense that if it wasn't taken at the practice, for example, you don't necessarily know if it was taken correctly. And so how do you make a decision based on that data? So there are certain social barriers to overcome there to be able to trust remote data. But I think we've reached a point now where we have to utilize, so we're, with COVID and everything, slightly backed into a corner, which was kind of good in a way. So we have to start to learn to be able to pull that data and make decisions from that. So we're just starting to think about that, to be honest. One of the challenges is also making sure that that data, that information is actually input, as Saira said, into the EHR where the doctor is seeing it. So when they're on a call with a patient or on a video conference with a patient, and not all of these systems are EHR integratable yet, but the companies that are developing these solutions need to be thinking about ensuring that it does, have to integrate if they want somebody to use it for decision making, and that comes, additional barriers, additional costs for implementation, because you have to create the APIs to connect to those provider systems. They aren't always easy. It's not always intuitive, to be able to connect into an EMR. So I think in the UK, in primary care, for example, we're kind of lucky in a way, because there's only 4 systems and 2 are the major players. And they've created, they've created partner programs, they've created API documentation to be able to have those integration capabilities. If you look like somewhere in the US, there's a lot more, and there are less, the requirements are less clear oftentimes. And so it takes time to work with those large systems to be able to integrate solutions that are often created by, small startups that have cost barriers, have, team size barriers. And so we really have to think about it. And I would hope that, larger players in the digital health space are thinking about how to enable companies such as ours, for example, and other small companies that are really creating these really innovative solutions, to be able to integrate them into the required workflows.
That's a major challenge. And another major challenge coming from the group chat is internet access. I can envision that the next digital health company that, or not the first digital health company that will become $1 trillion company, will engage the availability of the global population having internet access in rural areas. And I know Facebook kept in mind that they're trying to bring internet to Africa, to Asia, using different means, and that'll create a whole new markets. And Oliver, I know you're challenging, really striving to make big strides in a challenging area of neural biomarkers. How do you foresee, the advancement and engagement of technology to overcome this lack of internet availability in the global population, and how will even companies like BIOS or even just the whole UK system as we kind of evolve this technology, take advantage of growing internet access, or how can we overcome that?
I think to some extent the infrastructure that's being built and most governments are seeing internet access as almost a basic human right now. It's sort of a requirement for operating in much of the modern world. And I think most of the digital health solutions we're talking about here rely on that as well. Rely on the governments in the territories we operate in to provide that. And Facebook and Google managed to make so much money from people's data that it's worth them building internet infrastructure into rural locations to expand their user base. I think in terms of providing treatments without, in terms of providing care without internet access, a lot of this can be done kind of, hospital first and out. So it's not that people in areas without internet access entirely miss out on this. There are aspects of these technologies that I don't know if they will ever work without sort of widespread internet access. But at least being able to go hospital first, all the sort of in-hospital decision support, remote sort of data integration and follow-up will always be able to get there. I think in terms of rolling out this technology worldwide, you don't have to always consider. I think it's just bad design to assume that someone has internet access 24/7. It's bad technology design. You don't need to have a permanent mobile GSM connection in order to do remote monitoring, or in order to do remote in order to catch up with someone. That's really just bad technology design and can be overcome with just even small amounts of good engineering to be able to take advantage of patches of internet access and periodic connectivity. And I think we're seeing solutions like that in the massive rise in mobile payments, mobile sort of utility provision, sort of ordering that is now very prevalent in some of Africa and some of Asia as well. So I would say that these technologies don't. There are very, very, very few technologies, and actually I can't even think of a single one which requires 24/7 internet access. And if there is one, it's probably bad design. So a lot of that can be overcome by just doing better engineering. But I don't think we have to lose out on these patients having a better experience because they don't have internet access all the time.
Yeah, I agree. And one point brought up in the chat from the attendees is really, and I fully recognize it, and we've touched upon it, is the people who are actually seeking healthcare, seeking access, and also where the cost burden of the healthcare system is. The older population definitely has the need for more interface with healthcare, more integration, and whether it's the government paying for it or private insurance in the US, it's a challenge. In technology, it's kind of an inverse curve, depending on how we use technology. So the question for the group, and I'll direct it first to Saira, how do we overcome the technology naive or the challenges with technology with the broader spectrum population that is consuming healthcare at a high level, but might not be as adaptable to these kind of digital health solutions? How are you seeing this change, and how are you looking at both policy and solutions? You've commented on it before, but can you kind of elaborate on this concept?
I think there's a couple of strands to that. So I think it's a bit of a kind of misconception that older people don't use technology. So you've got the digital natives, and they are just better at using all forms of technology. However, research done in the States, certainly through AARP, which is the US's equivalent of, say, Age UK, their research has shown that, yes, you have the digital natives, but then you've got the silver surfers, who are the older population who actually have a lot more disposable income to spend on things such as iPads, iPhones, or whichever technology tablet that you're using. And they do use it to communicate. And so, this is the form of like most of the kind of digital health products or digital health technologies that we're asking people to use are, fairly straightforward. And then that goes on to the next strand, is the user experience side of things. So you've got to make sure that you're designing for both the digital native, but also that older population as well. You've got to make it simple to use. It's got to be easy, intuitive, and all of that. So you've got to make sure that it's usable across all generations, essentially. And then going from there is, I think Natalie earlier spoke about educating clinicians and to how to use technologies, but actually we've got to really start integrating the education for patients in the public to use technologies as well. So that's the kind of next move on in terms of, making sure that we are making it equitable across all. And then it kind of goes on to, are we exacerbating any health inequalities by introducing digital technology? So yes, certainly it's that generational difference. But then you go back to, it's not just a face-to-face consultation, or it's not just a remote consultation. You've got to use that omni-channel approach. Like if I want to do my banking, I can do it on my mobile phone, my desktop, I can go into the branch. You've got to make sure you're providing an omni-channel approach to all patients. So, whether they want to see somebody face-to-face, whether it's a telephone call, whether it's a video call, you've got to make sure it's that whole spectrum. It's not just one size fits all.
Excellent points. And I asked Natalie, I know you're at the interface of this and you've commented a lot. Can you expand upon this particular topic?
Sure, and I'll just add to what Saira said, which is great. I do think it's a massive, massive misconception. So older populations, I worked with older patients in clinics and in clinical trials. Older populations, from my experience at least, they are adopting technologies. They're some of the earlier adopters of VR and robotics in care homes, iPads for sure, voice assistants. And what we're seeing is that throughout the pandemic, they've been able to adopt telemedicine solutions quite well, which actually alleviates the pressure on their carers, so their children typically. So, I used to see the children having to take time off work to bring in their parents to the clinic. And now with telemedicine, that's time and money saved massively. So I think, just to reiterate, that it's quite a big misconception.
Yeah, I think Saira pointed out that something like 90% of UK doctors' appointments are now going over to telemedicine or outpatient appointments. Like that's also heavily that's of appointments. That's not of the population, right? That's skewed towards the people who predominantly use the healthcare system, which is skewed towards an older population. So yeah, I think that was a true narrative 8 years ago, but it's not true now.
And Aditya, how is Microsoft solving these interfaces, or maybe helping contribute, or how are you adapting algorithms potentially and what kind of algorithms are you approaching to help kind of, maybe it's not as big of an issue, but there is definitely components to work on from the naive versus more experienced population?
Yeah, I think the user experience is super important, even when we design these algorithms. So we work in multidisciplinary teams where we have, user experience specialists, designers, social scientists, together with clinicians, not only designing the algorithms, but also trying to figure out what the actual issues and challenges are. So for example, we've done some work in medical imaging where we try to optimize cancer radiotherapy workflows, and the way we design these algorithms is to really first study what the pain points are when you look at these treatment workflows, and then think about what could be machine learning solutions. And there are a variety of factors as well. It's not only about getting to the solution, but also taking into account what kinds of solutions can be justifiable to clinicians, for example, in this instance. And that requires, at the very beginning, collaborating with both clinicians and designers who understand the space.
Absolutely. And we're getting a great question regarding training of the next generation of clinicians and also the current generation of clinicians. And I'll obviously send this to Saira. You've mentioned it, and Natalie has mentioned it as well many times, the educational component. How is the training occurring with technologies and solutions literally coming online on a regular basis, and how training the trainer, for example, how is this actually occurring? And is it occurring in an effective rate, and what else can be done?
I think training for medical students is very different to, say, what mine was back in the year 2000. So I think that's rapidly changed. They're digital natives as well. The way that they interact with technology is very different as well. In terms of kind of implementation of technologies in hospitals, I think that's a major area of study, as well as like how do you effectively implement any given EHR, whatever system that you're bringing in. There needs to be training effectively rolled out for all of that. But then it goes on to each different technology that you're adding on, and literally by my kind of you learn on the job. Essentially, you kind of use it. It's like, here you go, you're using a new system today, figure out how it works. And that's where the kind of intuitiveness needs to come in, and the user experience, because more often than not, people are busy, they don't have time to do it, people don't want to do it, and when you're kind of thrown in there, you just kind of learn how to do it. And this is completely anecdotal. I'm sure there's a lot more education on board, but certainly I think a lot more of the kind of learning and professional development, the kind of CPD that you have to do in terms of maintaining your practice, some of it is more focused towards digital and making sure that you do your data protection modules and all of that, certainly to kind of cover that bit. But I think certainly that needs to be more integrated in terms of how you use it. But then there's so many different systems, it's very difficult to say, you've got to learn how to use 50 of these. So I think a lot of it is part of the people who are providing that technology, that they provide that educational kind of element to go with whichever technology it is.
If I can just add to that, maybe, we're building our solution on the whole premise that there is no way that a clinician can keep up with all of the latest information that's constantly coming out of scientific research, clinical trials, all these new technologies. And so we are hoping to be able to offer, recommendations and suggestions of what to use, how to manage, how to diagnose, based on utilizing an AI engine that can digest that information. And so it goes back to that notion of educating the clinicians that there is no way that they'll be able to handle that, and they need to adopt technology to be able to do that kind of work effectively, because no one brain can process so much information. That's why you have kind of, large care teams in some respects, but you can also offload some of that work to automation and AI and technology. And so it's that education component of being able to do that, I think, is really, really important. And I do think that it probably needs to come across more in clinician education. And the other thing that I believe should probably be kind of more in the curriculum is around just mental health for clinicians, to be honest, because it's just so overwhelming now. There's so much going on. There's so much science. There's so much technology, and there's so much paperwork and administration that doctors are just incredibly overwhelmed. And so being able to actually, handle their, that kind of burden, that kind of workload, the mental health components should also be part of the education.
That's a superb point. And, with companies having different resources to do different activities, maybe Natalie, you can comment or expand upon, if you have a dashboard of technology, what percentage of the company has to be just purely devoted to education of the technology, the application to physicians, to the patients? I mean, usually there's always a percentage shift in what's developing the technology, the regulatory percentage, the operational, but the educational, how much do you foresee a company has to focus on percentage-wise from the resources?
I think it depends on the size of the company and the stage of the company, because if it's a small company like ours is, then it's the whole company at a certain stage of development. So, you know, it's pre-launch and at launch and post-launch, because you're kind of going through those phases of R&D and then evaluation, regulatory, you know, marketing, all that. And so there is a phase where the whole company should be focused on the educational component, right? Training, you know, training, education, and support is kind of goes together, and that I don't think that should stop, you know, because in theory, that's once you launch a product, that's going to continue, and so all of the folks that are, you know, focused on support should be able to provide some form of educational component. But I think it depends, really. It depends on, you know, how many products does the company have, what's the size of the company, what stage of development they're at.
Absolutely. And I know we're coming on the call to action, Stephen, but I know there's another great question I'd really like to send to Oliver. The regulation of digital therapeutics doesn't exist. So how can companies like BIOS really shape the regulation, shape the industry around that, especially in an evolving space?
Yeah, I mean, I think regulation of digital therapeutics that are what have been sort of traditionally thought of digital therapeutics, companies like Pear Therapeutics, Achille, that are relying on behavioral change based on sort of data feedback via some sort of, or also via a patient app, like those have definitely fallen into a bit of a regulatory crevice where they sort of fell between different statuses, and I fully expect the FDA to catch up on that. I think they released some guidance on how they're thinking about it a couple of months ago, and that will start to become part of regulation over the coming years. From our perspective, you know, we're intervening directly on the nervous system, and that actually has a really rich history of regulatory covenants. So active implantable medical devices. It started with pacemakers. It then went from pacemakers into spinal cord stimulators for chronic pain, and deep brain stimulators for epilepsy, and then depression. So you know, we leverage the wide range of regulatory precedents that comes from neuromodulation fields and the cardiac pacemaker fields. I think, however, we even with that, like it's you're definitely sort of, you have to skew our technology to kind of look at it within that lens, because it's not a consistent tonic stimulus like a pacemaker. I think it's in conversation with the FDA. I think we have a huge problem in the UK right now with medical device regulation. We're behind the EU now with like adoption of, well, we're shortly going to, as of January, we'll be behind the EU with adoption of MDR compared to MDD. But the FDA, after sort of a rough time 5 years ago, is now in a really good position of having really good conversations with companies and about new technologies. And I think I would recommend anyone developing new technologies that I don't think people realize quite how open and interactive and willing to engage on these conversations the FDA are, and are very, very willing to understand new technologies, use them, and then think about what their position are relative to them. They, as I said, they've just issued some guidance around digital therapeutics over the last couple of months, and so the regulators, it's the regulators' job to be consistently engaged with the pace of technology development, and at the moment the FDA is doing that fantastically. I think the UK is going to see serious issues with this over the next 3 to 5 years unless we fix our regulatory position, which we're currently looking like we're going to just completely mess up as part of Brexit, with the government's position on MDR right now. But so the UK is setting itself up for 5 years of technology sort of lagging behind on device and pharmaceutical regulation, because we're sticking to an older standard that isn't moving forward with anyone else, which is just pointless. But the FDA right now is in a really mature place and a really, really productive place to have these kinds of conversations.
Completely agree. And there's question, Aditya, directed right toward you, and I think it's a very insightful question. How was the vision for Microsoft to get into the healthcare space really born? Because it's actually very intriguing, and I know you were very much involved with this. So maybe you can kind of describe the history and even the concept, and maybe this can shed a light on how other tech companies will really get into it as well.
Yeah, I think Microsoft has dabbled in this multiple times, and I think this is probably the third time we're doing this and doing it really seriously because of the huge opportunity and the vision that we have for AI. And of course, Microsoft has been involved with healthcare with respect to products like Windows, Office, and so on and so forth. But this time around, I think from a research standpoint, what we're focusing on is truly trying to understand how a data-driven approach might actually augment the existing healthcare system, but also to think about how data science and AI can reimagine the way we do medicine and healthcare. So I think as far as what we're doing today is concerned, we're investing in a number of areas, both in the healthcare space as well as life sciences. And it's all about building tools to kind of augment various stakeholders to do much more than the sum of the parts. So, and that's pretty much, where we're at right now. So it's about, innovating in the AI space. But also healthcare is quite exciting from an AI standpoint because it's one of these areas where safety is of paramount importance, and so is responsibility. So it's not just about, for example, developing a solution and making recommendations, but with each recommendation comes a great deal of responsibility, which also means that it's this kind of an application also changes the way the field of AI works. So it's quite exciting from a research standpoint, and it's also very exciting that, since the whole world is moving to AI, the question really is, how are we really going to make that kind of impact in the healthcare space, which hasn't happened as yet. So,
Excellent point. Robert, I know we're coming on time. I just want to be respectful. Should we move to the call to action, or how would you like to proceed, Robert?
Hi, yeah, excellent discussions here with the questions and answers. Yeah, perhaps if we move to that call of action, that's absolutely fine.
So I'll let the group kind of, I know everyone's different on different screen. I'm just going to go through my panels on my Zoom. And maybe Natalie, can you start off with a call of action?
Sure. So I think my call to action would just be really simple, just be to get involved, because there's a shortage of technologists. There's a shortage of AI engineers, data scientists. If this is something that is of interest to you, just get involved and think about the future and everything that we have said for the next 5 to 10 years, but also think about the past and the history of healthcare and why it is the way that it is now, because I think that helps with the understanding, with some of the habits, with some of the challenges. And I think that it is important to have that kind of 360 view. But really it is to just, if this is interesting to you at all, get involved. I think in health technology, you'll see the impact to the patient faster than in pharma or biotech, at least from my experience. So if you're that kind of person who likes to see, rapid impact, then health technology is a really, really exciting space to be. There's a lot coming down the pipeline.
And Oliver, you want to add?
Yeah, I'd like to. I didn't answer the question about education, but I think my call to action would be to for anyone, whether you're on the technology side or on the health side, you can't operate in health technology without being informed about both. If you're a clinician, you need to spend as much time as possible understanding what technology is always going to outpace the time since you were last in med school. We find this specifically, right? Like we work in neurotechnology. Like epilepsy doctors understand reading neurological scans and brainwave scans in order to understand how they deliver a treatment. But almost no other field of medicine, except for potentially cardiologists, understand that concept. But it's applicable to all of them. And so being able to keep up with that pace of science and do that clinical education is essential. So, and then on the other side of that, seeing the number of technologists that build bad solutions because they don't understand enough about their clinical counterparts is also depressing. So both sides of the health and technology space need to be as educated as possible about what the other half are doing, and preferably just work together as closely integrated as you can.
And Aditya?
Yeah, so I think there's a huge opportunity for AI to kind of revolutionize healthcare, and to achieve this, I think we need to think more about how to develop a trusted AI approach. And really, the call to action is domain experts understanding what AI means, and AI experts understanding what the domain really means, because trust in AI is kind of multifaceted and goes beyond metrics of accuracy and uncertainty, which typically is what we think about when we think about algorithmic performance. So really, it's about understanding each other's work and to a deeper level, so that we can actually build something that is way bigger than the sum of the parts.
Saira?
I'll go back to what I was saying right at the beginning. When you're creating anything, the patient needs to be at the forefront. I know this is really basic, but a lot of the technologies that we see out there, it's kind of almost a bit of an afterthought. It really needs to focus on a pain point for that patient journey, and they need to be at the forefront of it. And then the other thing is actually going back to basics again in terms of policy, thinking how can we circumvent the interoperability issue? It's huge. It's going to be one of the biggest barriers to effective digital health. What are the kind of payment incentives? Again, that's a big barrier. Who's actually paying for this technology at the end of the day? And then the data security and privacy side of things, people need to trust it. Or people need to trust how their data is being used, but also ensure that any technology that's being used is safe and secure.
Oh, thank you. I think the panel did such an excellent job summarizing the call to action. It's almost hard to add. I'll just make a few points. AI is a tool. It is not a black box. It has to be validated. The patient definitely has to be educated. The clinician has to be educated, and education is key to the component. Going into this space, if people are new, they have to take into account there's so many stakeholders in this: the government, the insurance, the patient, the clinician, and it has to be accessible. I know we've talked about different generations of integration. The tools have to be simple, dashboards have to be usable, and it has to be scalable. And you have to keep in mind broad populations that will use it. So, I'm looking forward to the future generations and our future colleagues contributing to this who are on the call, and keeping in mind that this is a broader impact than just us. This is a global impact. It's a human impact. It has broad-standing economic, but societal and personal implications to it. So I obviously thank everyone for their attention during this panel, and I'll hand it over to and participation during your busy schedule, since it was really, really insightful, but also really, really thought-provoking how the different angles really need to perseverate and expand upon. So I'll hand it over to Robert at this point.
Thank you so much, Michael. And just to echo again, thank you so much for our fantastic members of this panel today for shedding light on the digital health revolution that we're all living through today during these uncertain times. And only because you can't thank yourself, thank you very much to Michael, Kiebish, for really chairing this panel in such a fantastic way. So a note for our Leaders of Tomorrow delegates who are watching us on their web portal. We are now transitioning to quite a long period within the program where we've got some break sessions and time for speed networking for people to connect. And this is going to be via the spatial platform. So if you go to your portal, click on networking, there's the link. And we hope to see you all there. Thank you very much.